Chapter 3: The Mind as a Prison. There is a space in my head that I can't leave. I've tried, oh, I've tried, but there are no doors, no windows, no cracks in the walls wide enough to let me slip through. It isn't a room, though that would make it easier to describe. A room is finite, a room is contained. What I live in is vast, endless, and yet claustrophobic. A labyrinth of thoughts that loop and twist back on themselves until I can no longer tell where one ends and another begins. I've come to understand that this space is not a gift. People love to romanticize the so-called brilliant mind as if it is some paradise of endless possibilities. But there is no paradise here, only the relentless hum of ideas that refuse to stop, even when they begin to tear themselves apart. My mind is not a haven, it is a prison, and I am its sole inhabitant. When I was younger, I didn't see it that way. Back then, I thought my mind was infinite, a boundless expanse where I could create and discover without limitation. It was exhilarating, intoxicating even, to lose myself in the sheer volume of my own thoughts. I would stay awake for days, following a single idea through its endless permutations, convinced that if I just thought hard enough, dug deep enough, I would find some fundamental truth waiting for me at the bottom. But there is no bottom. That is the cruelest trick of all. The mind doesn't end. It goes on and on, folding in on itself, expanding and contracting until what once felt like freedom begins to feel like suffocation. And the more you try to escape, the tighter the walls close in around you. This is what they don't tell you about genius, that it is not a gift, but a burden. To have a mind that moves too fast, that burns too bright, is not a blessing. It is a trap. I have always been a prisoner of my own thoughts. Even as a child, I was unable to stop myself from overthinking, overanalyzing, turning every moment into a problem that needed to be solved. My teachers called it curiosity. My parents called it intelligence, but I knew better. It wasn't curiosity that drove me. It was compulsion. My mind is never quiet. It is a machine that runs without rest, grinding through ideas and memories and fears until there is nothing left but dust. The fire that fuels it is relentless, and though I have tried to dampen it, to slow its pace, it will not stop. And then there is the water. The fire keeps me trapped, but the water keeps me still. It floods the labyrinth, turning my thoughts into echoes that I can't quite follow. It blurs the edges, makes it impossible to see the way forward. This is the paradox of my prison. The fire and water work together, though they are opposites. The fire drives me to think, to create, to move forward at any cost. The water holds me back, drowning my thoughts in doubt and uncertainty. Together they create a perfect storm, a cycle of motion and stagnation that I cannot escape. There are moments when I try to explain this to people, though I've learned not to expect understanding. How do you describe the feeling of being trapped inside your own mind? How do you explain what it's like to live in a space that you cannot leave, that you cannot quiet, that you cannot control? They listen, nodding politely, their faces blank with incomprehension. They tell me I'm brilliant, that I should be grateful for the gifts I've been given. And maybe they're right. Maybe I should be grateful, but gratitude is difficult to muster when your greatest gift is also your greatest curse. There was a time when I thought I could escape. I tried everything: meditation, therapy, endless self help books promising peace of mind. I tried silence, shutting out the world to quiet the storm inside me. But silence only made it worse. Without distraction, the fire burned hotter and the water rose higher. My thoughts turned inward, folding in on themselves until they became unbearable. I would sit in the dark for hours, staring at nothing, my mind racing in circles, searching for an exit that didn't exist. This is the thing about prisons. They are designed to keep you in. And when the prison is your own mind, there is no escape. I've spent years trying to understand why my mind works this way. Is it biology? Some quirk of evolution that left me with a brain that refuses to rest? Or is it something deeper, something more fundamental to who I am? I don't believe in souls. I've already said that. But if I did, I would think of mine as fractured, split between fire and water, unable to reconcile itself. I would think of it as a storm, endlessly churning, destroying everything in its path. But the truth is, there is no soul, no grand explanation for why I am the way I am. There is only the mind, a prison of neurons and synapses, a machine built to think and think and think, even when there is nothing left to think about. Some days, I wonder if this is what it means to be human, to live in a state of constant conflict, torn between the fire that drives us forward and the water that holds us back, to be trapped in our own heads, unable to escape the endless churn of thought and emotion. And yet, even as I write this, I can feel the fire flickering back to life. It is faint, but it is there, feeding on the words, on the act of creation. The water has not receded, it never truly does. But for now, the fire burns brighter. Perhaps this is the only escape I have, to keep moving, to keep creating, even when the fire consumes me, even when the water drowns me. To live in the tension between the two, not as a prisoner, but as something else. There is a kind of quiet that doesn't simply surround you, it becomes you. You don't hear it anymore. You breathe it in, carry it with you, wear it like a second skin. That is the quiet of isolation, not the productive solitude people romanticize, that curated silence filled with books and incense and thoughts framed neatly in notebooks. No, this is the other kind, the kind that creeps in when your voice goes unused for too long, when your name has not been spoken aloud in days, when your presence makes no imprint on the world around you. It starts as relief. That's the trick. You think you found peace. You think the stillness means you are finally free from the demands of performance, from the weight of being seen. You mistake absence for rest, and then it deepens. I've lived with people and still felt isolated. I've sat in rooms filled with conversation and laughter and felt like glass transparent, untouchable, hollow. I've answered questions automatically, nodded at the right times, laughed on cue, and left without anyone noticing I hadn't said anything real. That's the cruel thing about isolation. It isn't always tied to aloneness. It's about connection or the absence of it. It's about speaking and not being heard, or worse, being heard and not being recognized. There were weeks, months, even where my phone wouldn't ring unless it was a spam call, where the only proof of my existence was the echo of my own footsteps, where every human interaction felt like an intrusion or a transaction, where I became untethered from the rhythm of other people's lives. I watched birthdays pass, saw holidays parade by from behind glass. People moved in packs, and I moved in shadows. When I was younger, I thought intelligence would be enough. That if I was sharp enough, perceptive enough, articulate enough, people would gather around me like moths to flame. I thought understanding people would make me visible to them. But insight isn't a bridge, it's a mirror. And most people don't want to see themselves that clearly. The more clearly I saw, the lonelier I became. People liked what I could offer, my thoughts, my ability to name the things they couldn't quite articulate. But they didn't want to linger. They wanted to borrow the mirror, not stand in front of it. Isolation sharpens things. It strips away the social lubricant of casual chatter and leaves only the raw noise of your own mind. You wake up and hear every doubt, every unresolved fear, every unprocessed grief. They speak in chorus. They fill the room. There is no one to distract you from their voices, no one to contradict the narrative you build inside your skull. I became my own echo chamber. At first, I didn't mind. I've always preferred depth to noise. But even the deepest thoughts can turn poisonous when they go unchecked. I began to talk to myself, not out loud, but in endless internal arguments. I dissected every past interaction, revised every word I had spoken to anyone. I conducted postmortems on relationships that hadn't even ended, just faded. I began to believe that I had driven them all away, that my fire had scorched every bridge. It wasn't entirely untrue. There is a mirror in my flat, an old rectangular thing mounted on a cracked wardrobe. I avoided it for weeks. Then one morning I stood in front of it, naked and unblinking, determined to look until I saw something true. What I saw wasn't ugly, it wasn't monstrous, it was worse, it was empty. My eyes looked back at me with no demand, no defiance. They were the eyes of someone who had not been looked at in a very long time. We say humans are social creatures, but what we mean is that we require recognition. To be seen is to be reminded that you exist, that you have edges, that you matter. Isolation removes the mirror of others and leaves you to define yourself without reflection. It sounds noble, even philosophical, but it is maddening. The problem with isolation is that it doesn't just affect your relationships with others, it distorts your relationship with time. Days melt into each other. The distinction between weekday and weekend becomes irrelevant. Meals become erratic. Sleep becomes inconsistent. You forget how to pace yourself because there is no one to pace yourself against. I found myself walking the same loop through my neighborhood, not because I enjoyed it, but because it gave shape to the day. Without that loop, I wouldn't know where the morning ended and the afternoon began. Even the weather lost meaning. Rain didn't cancel plans. Sunshine didn't promise joy. The sky was just backdrop. The air, something to move through. There were moments, too, of terrifying clarity. Moments where I saw myself from above, like watching a film. I watched the way I reached for the same mug, stood in the same spot to drink my coffee, read the same passage twice just to fill time. I watched myself disappear into routines that served no purpose other than to keep me from noticing the silence. I began to question the point of communication, not in the suicidal sense, not in the way that signals danger, but in the philosophical sense. If no one is listening, why speak? If no one responds, why reach out? I stopped responding to messages, even the few that came. I left them unread until the red notification badges became part of the wallpaper. I told myself people would understand. I told myself they wouldn't notice. I told myself, perhaps cruelly, that I wouldn't notice if they disappeared either. But that's the thing about isolation. It teaches you who you miss. Not just the people, but the parts of yourself that only existed in their presence. The way you used to laugh, the ease of unfiltered conversation, the small glances that didn't need explaining, the spontaneous, the unplanned, the unprepared. There are entire versions of myself I can only access when I am with certain people. Without them, those selves go dormant. And in isolation, you begin to forget which parts of you are real and which are just reactions. I missed the version of myself that didn't analyze every word. I missed the version that said ridiculous things and didn't immediately regret them. I missed a version that felt like a person and not a thesis. So I started talking out loud, not in madness, not in breakdown, but in reclamation. I spoke my thoughts into the air, gave them weight. I answered my own questions. I argued with imaginary versions of friends. I reminded myself what my voice sounded like. It helped. A little, but nothing helps like presence. Actual human presence. the kind you don't have to earn or explain or justify. I remember the first time I saw a friend again after months of isolation. We didn't hug, we didn't talk deeply, we just sat in a park, drank coffee, and let the silence between us mean something. And in that silence, I felt the shape of myself return, not in full, but enough. There is a myth that isolation makes you wiser, that solitude sharpens the mind, that you emerge from it with revelations. Maybe that's true for some, but for me, it made everything more fragile. Every thought felt like it could break if examined too closely. Every insight felt untested, unshared, unanchored. Wisdom, I have come to believe, requires friction. It requires dialogue. It requires being challenged, disagreed with, laughed at. It requires others, and so does healing. I am not healed. I am not even whole, but I am at least no longer invisible. When I speak now, I try to mean it. When I listen, I try to hear more than just words. When I am alone, I try not to let the quiet lie to me. And when I look in the mirror, I try not to flinch, because this is the face I have. This is the voice I own. This is the life I am shaping, slowly, painfully, with whatever fragments the silence didn't steal. I may never be fluent in connection. I may always carry a bit of the quiet with me, but I am here, and sometimes being here is enough. Chapter 4: The Beauty and Terror of Balance. The first time I considered that fire and water might not be enemies, I felt betrayed by my own thoughts. Balance seemed like a concession, a cheap word to paper over the violence in my head. How can there be balance between two forces whose sole purpose is to destroy each other? What kind of harmony exists between the flood that drowns and the fire that raises everything in its path? And yet, as I sat in the aftermath of another sleepless night, my mind a battlefield of ash and floodwaters, a thought emerged, not as a resolution, but as a quiet, persistent question. What if fire and water aren't at war? The question haunted me. It didn't come with answers, only possibilities, half-formed ideas that refused to cohere into anything tangible. Still, it was enough to shift something inside me, a crack in the foundation of my assumptions. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way fire and water, for all their destructiveness, also created after a wildfire. The earth renews itself. New growth emerges, fed by the ash of what once was. And water, despite its relentless erosion, carves rivers, valleys, canyons. It shapes the world in ways that are both devastating and beautiful. Could it be, I wondered, that the same was true inside me? That the fire and water were not just forces of destruction, but of creation as well. It wasn't an easy thought to accept. I had spent years defining myself by my fire, my drive, my ambition, the intensity of my mind. The water, by contrast, had always been the enemy, the thing that held me back, that threatened to drown me in doubt and reflection. But what if I had been wrong? I began to look back on my life, not through the lens of fire or water alone, but through their interplay. I thought of the times when my fire had burned too hot, leaving me exhausted, brittle, incapable of connecting with the world around me. And I thought of the water, how it had forced me to slow down, to reflect, to see the cracks in my thinking before they became fractures. There were other moments too, times when the water had risen too high, threatening to overwhelm me with doubt and inertia. In those moments, it was the fire that had saved me, reigniting my will to move forward, to create, to survive. It was not balance, exactly. The fire and water did not exist in harmony. They collided, clashed, tore at each other. But in their tension, something larger emerged. I began to think of myself not as a prisoner, but as a system, not a mind trapped between two warring elements, but a living ecosystem, shaped and reshaped by the forces within me. In this system, fire was not the enemy of water, nor water the enemy of fire. They were part of a cycle, destruction and renewal, ambition and reflection, chaos and clarity. The fire burned away what no longer served me, and the water reshaped the ruins into something new. It was not a peaceful process. There was no stillness here, no equilibrium, but there was motion, growth, evolution. One night, as I lay in bed, caught between sleep and wakefulness, I imagined the fire and water not as separate forces, but as partners in a dance. The fire moved first, sweeping across the floor with its wild, unrestrained energy. It leapt and spun, lighting up the space with its brilliance. But then the water followed, slower, more deliberate. It did not extinguish the fire, but tempered it, guiding its movements, shaping its heat into something steady, sustainable. Together, they created steam, a new force born of their collision. It rose into the air, filling the space with warmth and motion, a tangible reminder of their combined power. I thought of my mind as that space, as the dance floor where fire and water collided, not in war, but in creation. The fire drove me forward, but the water ensured that I did not lose myself in the process. Together, they made me who I was, not whole, not perfect, but alive. There is a beauty in this tension, but also a terror. To live with fire and water inside you is to live in constant motion, never fully at peace. It is to accept that there will always be destruction, always be struggle, always be something that must be torn down and rebuilt. But it is also to understand that this is what it means to grow, that to be human is not to find balance, but to embrace the forces that shape you, to let them pull you apart and put you back together again, stronger, sharper, more complete. I wish I could tell you that I've mastered this process, that I've learned how to wield fire and water with precision, to harness their power without losing myself in the chaos. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I am still learning. I still fight the fire when it burns too hot, still fear the water when it rises too high. I still feel trapped, at times by the forces inside me, unsure of how to move forward. But I no longer see them as enemies. I no longer see myself as a victim of their conflict. Instead, I see myself as a work in progress, a system in motion, a mind that is both fragile and resilient, destructive and creative, broken and whole. If you are reading this, perhaps you know what it is to live in tension. Perhaps you have felt the fire and water inside you, pulling you in opposite directions, threatening to tear you apart. If so, I have no answers for you. Only this: keep moving. Let the fire burn, let the water rise, and trust that in their collision you will find yourself again. There are rooms in the mind where no one goes willingly, rooms we construct not with brick or wood, but with repetition, avoidance, fear. These are the places where disorder lives. Not disorder as chaos, the cinematic kind, not the wild-haired genius in a cluttered room, papers scattered like snow. That too is performance. No, I mean disorder as structure, the structure that emerges when the natural architecture of thought begins to fail, when the elegant bridges of logic collapse and in their place rise mazes, not designed for exit, built only to contain. I've spent much of my life pretending my mind was a cathedral, all vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows of thought. I believed the fire in me kept the lights burning, but there are wings of this cathedral where light does not reach, where the air grows thick, where memory curls like smoke, and in those corners disorder builds its walls. I did not know what to call it at first. The shifting, the looping, the sense that something had gone subtly but irreversibly wrong. Words still came, insight still flashed, But underneath it all, there was dissonance, not like music gone out of tune, more like an orchestra continuing to play after the conductor has left the room. There were signs, of course, small things, forgetting the order of simple tasks, not remembering whether I had eaten, losing hours to spirals of thought that led nowhere, making notes to remind myself of notes, redundancy as survival, ritual as scaffolding. I developed habits, not rituals, habits, small compulsions that help me feel anchored, checking doors, touching the edge of my desk 3 times before sitting down, reading the same sentence aloud before writing anything, not because I believed these things held power, but because they offered rhythm. Disorder does not announce itself. It seeps in like water. I became meticulous in strange ways, organizing files no one would see, naming folders with dates and symbols, trying to impose order on a mind that no longer responded to logic. I wasn't trying to be efficient. I was trying not to vanish, because that's what disorder threatens, the integrity of the self. It whispers daily that the version of you others recognize is a facade, that the person you were is deteriorating, that you are being hollowed from the inside. I would sit in meetings, articulate, incisive, and wonder if anyone could see the cracks. Could they tell I was balancing on routines like tightropes? That one misstep would plunge me into silence. They didn't. People don't see the inner architecture, they see the mask. And I've always been good with mask. The worst part is the awareness. I have never lost contact with reality. That would be a mercy. I know exactly when my thoughts begin to fracture. I can map it, I can name it, and that naming becomes its own torment. Because now I am not only disordered, I am witness to it. Imagine watching yourself lose coherence in real time. Imagine knowing the thought is coming, but not being able to stop it. Imagine being fluent in your own unraveling. There is a cruelty in cognition turned on itself. There were days I would write something, read it back, and feel horror, not because it was wrong, but because it was perfect. Too perfect, too polished, stripped of any sign of struggle. I feared that my ability to write convincingly would hide the rot beneath. I feared that I could build a palace of words on a foundation of sand, and worse, that no one would notice until it collapsed. Disorder does not mean inability. I can still function. I can still produce. That is what makes it so insidious. Productivity becomes a shield, a way to deflect concern. Look how much I've done. Look how clearly I speak. Look how articulate I remain. But underneath, entropy, noise, flickering, you begin to mistrust even the sharpness. Because what if it's the last flare before the dark? I started keeping 2 notebooks, one for the world clean, structured, shareable, the other for myself. That one is raw. Sentences that trail off, scribbles in the margins, repetitions. Please, it's not art, it's not process, it's a map of disorder, and it tells the truth. It tells me that I am not lost, only rearranged, that the architecture of my mind is not broken, only unfamiliar, that disorder is not failure, it is resistance to an order that no longer fits. I do not romanticize this. I do not call it beautiful, but I have learned to navigate it. Like a city after an earthquake, the streets have changed, the landmarks are gone, but you can still move. You can still find your way. You walk slowly, you learn the new layout, you build again, and perhaps this time you leave space for the cracks.